This is one of two meetings that are going to be the same meeting. This one's tonight, and the next one will be Wednesday night. So thank you for coming. And what we're going to present to you tonight is the phase 2 of the zoning ordinance updates that the city has been working on for the last year. But really what you're going to hear tonight is the result of several years of work. It's something we've been working intentionally on over the last 12 months, but all of this work really has been the result of several years of analysis into the city zoning code. And so what you're hearing tonight really is the result of all of that work. But thank you for being here. What we'll do is we're going to cover each of these topics. And really any one of these topics we could probably talk for 30 minutes on. But to keep the meeting moving, and also because we don't know where everybody in the room is in terms of your familiarity with zoning. If you know nothing about zoning or Atlanta zoning, there's a lot more to take in, and it can be very difficult to understand. But some of you in the room have more familiarity with it. So we're going to cover this, but there may be things that we don't hit on. There may be things that you just have more questions on, or that maybe didn't make sense. So please take notes, keep all of your questions noted. And then after this presentation, we have the whole rest of the night. We'll have about a 40-minute presentation, and we have the whole rest of the night where our team is going to be available to talk with you and answer any questions you may have. But also, members of the planning staff, the city planning staff are here. If you can raise your hand if you're... Great. So city planning staff is here. They're also a resource for us tonight to be able to help us understand what it is that is being contemplated through this proposal. So with that, let me get started. So this is a little bit of what I was just describing, that over the last few years, there's been a lot of work that's taken place as it relates to trying to understand the city zoning ordinance and what could be done to make things better. In 2015, an exhaustive analysis of the entire zoning code was undertaken. Myself, I'm Aaron Fortner, by the way, with Campus Planning Group. I was a part of that work with Caleb Rossico with TSW and Bob Zeckler, a zoning attorney who's here. And so the three of us have worked on this 2015 diagnostic of the zoning code. And what that diagnostic did was really looked at what are all of the problems with the zoning code? What are the problems that need to be solved? What are the gaps that need to be filled? We also looked at what are other cities doing? What are best practices? What are cities of similar sizes doing all across the nation? And how can we learn from that? We also looked at what are all the variances that people keep asking for and all the rezonings that are taking place. What is it that keeps getting asked for so that we can learn from that to try and make sure that a new code could understand those things and address those things? And the result of that was a few key principles. One was that the code, the future code, needs to change. We need to do something differently to implement the policies and the plans that we have in the city. The last 10, 20 years, we've undertaken a lot of planning initiatives in the city, whether it's beltline planning or just neighborhood planning. And so what we realized is that the new code really does need to catch up to what we've been planning, all the plans that we've had. We also need to create a code that's easier to use. We need a code that you don't have to hire a zoning attorney to understand it. You don't have to go hire professionals to help you understand what it means. So it needs to be easier to use and to understand. So we ended up making recommendations that fit into two categories. We recommended that there's some changes that need to be made to our zoning code that are going to need to wait until a complete rewrite and overhaul of the zoning code is done, which is exactly what the city intends to do. But that is going to be a process, and you can imagine updating the entire zoning code for the entire city, that's going to take several years to actually complete that, to do that properly. So there are things that do need to get done to the code that will happen with a complete update of the code. But that's going to be more in a 3 to 5 year timeline. But then we identified things that could be done right now in a 1 to 2 year time frame that we don't want to wait for. That there's things that just really need to be done, that the city needs, that neighborhoods need, or the city staff needs, there's things we identified that really could be done more quickly in the next year or two. And we call those quick fixes. So these are things that really could be done quickly in a 1 to 2 year time frame. And that really is tonight what we're talking about. Proposed changes to the zoning code that can be done relatively quickly. In the diagnostic of the code, we also ended up identifying some just key categories for the work that needs to be done to the code that was really explained every single recommendation that was made. Improving the urban design of our city, protecting our neighborhood character, creating vibrant corridors and districts, expanding transportation options, ensuring housing diversity, supporting jobs and innovation, and creating user-friendly regulations and processes. So tonight, when we tell you about the changes that are being proposed, they're all going to fall into one of those categories. So these are those quick fixes that were recommended out of the 2015 zoning diagnostic work. And over the last year, we've been working on these. Last August and September, we began work on phase 1. Phase 1, if you've been active at your NPU or your neighborhood level, you will have heard about these. If you came to our round of meetings that were last fall, you would have heard these. And these are these ones up here at the top. And I won't get into the details of all of those because they're all pretty complex, and that was our last phase of work. And again, those have been going around the NPUs. But tonight, we're going to talk about this phase 2. This is the phase of work that really is some of this is very complicated, some of this is really pretty big moves. And so these were the ones that we put into the second phase of work because we knew this was going to take longer. This was going to take a little bit more thought, a little bit more work, and the phase 1 were the quicker things that we could do, and now we're into our second phase. And we're going to walk through every single one of these tonight. Just in terms of the public engagement, again, we got this meeting tonight, and on April 11th at Trinity Presbyterian will be the same meeting as tonight. We'll have that this Wednesday night. But we're also going to have these 8 opportunities through open houses where we're going to be able to be available, and planning staff will be available to the community in these 8 different times and 8 different dates at locations all over the city. These are also on the website. If you go to the website noted there, zoningatl.com. All of these locations and dates and times are on that website. And each one of these open houses will be a chance to, again, come and talk to staff and try to understand better what's being proposed. Some of these things, you may hear some of this tonight, and then in the next week or two, you may think of some questions that you didn't have tonight. You may be thinking about these things more. You may start looking around more with these things in mind, and you may have more questions and want to know more, and you could come to these open houses and get more answers to your questions at any of these open houses. Okay, so now we're going to walk through these proposed fixes for our phase 2. This first topic is what we call accessory dwellings. And so this is all in this category of trying to ensure housing diversity in the city of Atlanta. So this is an idea. Accessory dwelling is the idea that in the back of a lot of a single family property that you could have a smaller living unit in the back of your property. This is a historic form of building and of living that is really a national thing. You see this in cities all over the country. But you even see this historically in Atlanta neighborhoods. There's many neighborhoods in Atlanta, but you still see the signs of accessory dwellings from a time when this was permitted and allowed in the city of Atlanta. It's something that was allowed all the way up until the 1980s in our zoning code. It was something that was permitted as of right. And so this is something that many neighborhoods over the last 10 or 20 years have advocated for more opportunities for affordable living in a neighborhood, but also this is also an opportunity for property owners to have a revenue stream or an income stream with their property as property taxes rise in the city. This can be a way to offset that kind of an impact. So this is being proposed to be allowed in our single family neighborhoods, which are really R1 through R4 in the city of Atlanta. Right now, today, every single family neighborhood in the city of Atlanta allows a guest house. That's allowed in every R1 through R4 and R5 zoning district in the city of Atlanta. What this is doing by allowing an accessory dwelling unit, this would simply make it possible to have a kitchen in that dwelling unit so that it can be an actual dwelling that somebody could live in. So this again is something that used to be allowed citywide. So this would be basically going back to the way it used to be before our code prohibited it and make it something that's allowed. So we're proposing that for R1 through R4. We also are proposing that there should just be a consistent treatment and approach to allowing accessory dwellings in all the R districts so that they're all treated the same. We also are proposing that there would be no parking requirement for the accessory dwelling. Usually these are things that fit very well into the fabric of the existing neighborhood, and parking can be accommodated either on the driveway or on-street parking. And then also, one key part of this is that just by allowing an accessory dwelling unit, that would not allow you to negate or exceed other regulations related to development in the single-family neighborhood. So for example, you couldn't exceed your lot coverage requirements in the single-family neighborhood just because you could do an accessory dwelling. You wouldn't be able to exceed your setback requirements, density requirements, stormwater requirements. None of that could be exceeded or negated just by building an accessory dwelling. All that would still have to be met. So what that means is some sites, some lots, some properties may not be able to create an accessory dwelling because they're too constrained, it's too small of a site. There's also just going to be some barrier to creating accessory dwellings in the fact that they cost, on average, $100,000 to $150,000 to build a new accessory dwelling. And so there's just going to be a financial obstacle to creating an accessory dwelling. But the zoning should get out of the way. And for every lot that can accommodate one, and for every property owner that would like to create one, we want the zoning to get out of the way and allow that to happen. And this is just a note here that in Decatur, accessory dwellings were allowed and created as the zoning code was changed to allow accessory dwellings in 2015, and to date, only 17 have been built. And again, this is sort of a reflection of some of the barriers. Yes, ma'am?
You want us to hold our questions?
Yeah, that would be great, yeah. Because all of our team is going to be available to answer questions, but definitely keep notes of your questions, yeah. Okay, number 2, this is something we call, in the planning world, missing middle housing. And that might not make sense to you, so let me explain what that means. In our city, and in many cities across the country, if you look at this diagram on the bottom right, we've got, in Atlanta, lots of neighborhoods with single-family houses. And then we've got many places in Atlanta now that are becoming high-density, multifamily, mixed-use, very dense parts of our city. So think of Midtown and downtown, and area around Ponce City Market and Buckhead. And there's many areas that are becoming very high-density. And then we have lots of neighborhoods. But we're sort of missing things that are in between those two things. And really, what we're missing is what we used to historically get a lot of, which is smaller scale, multifamily development, that it could have been 2 stories, or it could have been 3 stories, it could have been 4 units, it could have been 8 units, it could have been 12 units, that fits right on the edge of a neighborhood, or sometimes it was in the middle of a neighborhood at a trolley stop. And it really fit well within the fabric of a historic neighborhood. But it wasn't very dense, and it really wasn't very big. And so in the planning world nationally, that's starting to get called the missing middle. It's a way of living, it's a form of housing that is oftentimes affordable, that sits right in between either a single family house or very high density, dense nodes of our city. And so what we've seen is that we actually have a significant amount of that in our city today. And a lot of this is a remnant and left over from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s when these were getting built in the city. And if you see this map, we have this out back on the back too, you can see this closer. But all the red dots on this map are the locations where all of those units are, all over our city. And they're spread all over our older, traditional, more historic neighborhoods all over the city. So we want to do 2 things. We want to create a way that new missing middle could be created in our city. We really don't have a great tool for that today. There's really not, in our current zoning code, a great option and tool for builders or developers or communities that want to see missing middle happen. And then the second thing we want to do is we want to allow the existing missing middle housing, the older buildings that have missing middle housing, we want to make that easier for them to do that. So the first thing is creating a new zoning district that could be used for new development and new creation of missing middle housing. We think that this could be done by creating a new MR district that we're calling MRMM. And MR basically means multifamily residential, and MM is for missing middle. We already have an MR district in the city of Atlanta. It goes MR1 to MR6. We're proposing an MRMM. It would be given these following development classifications. You would allow a 5-foot side yard. It would only be able to have 12 units per building, because we found that really that's the high end of what a missing middle building would be. It would not allow any non-residential uses. It's not intended to be commercial or even mixed use. That it would have no allowance for parking decks or structures. These don't work that way. These are very small. They usually fit well into the fabric of a neighborhood with just surface parking. There would be 0.5 parking spaces per unit, and it would be allowed to be located in our low-density residential land use areas that are in the comprehensive plan of the city. And so this would be a tool for creating new missing middle. Now what we're doing here is we're talking about creating the district, but what we're not talking about right now is actually rezoning any parts of the city to this. This would be a new thing that would still have to come before the neighborhoods and the MPUs through a rezoning. An applicant would say, this is a site that I'm interested in creating missing middle. I want to use that new designation. And then they would have to come before the neighborhood and the MPU to see if that was something that was viable. So we're not proposing to rezone anything to this district. We just want to create the district so it becomes an option for the future. The second thing we want to do is we want to allow for existing buildings that are missing middle to be able to be kept up and invested in, because these are valuable. And you saw the map of how many of these are in our city. So currently, these existing missing middle buildings, and again, think about the different neighborhoods that you may have seen these in, that they're 4-plexes or 8-plexes or 12-plexes, and they're very small and they blend in well into a neighborhood. Today, most of those properties are zoned single family. So if you see that building, it's most likely zoned today single family, which means that technically it's grandfathered in if it's still in use. But what it means is that the single-family zoning is making that building not compliant with the zoning. That means that use in that building is something that's just grandfathered in because it doesn't comply with the single-family zoning, because it's not single-family. It's not a single-family house. It's a 4-plex or a 6-plex. And so what we're proposing is that existing historic missing middle housing be allowed to be improved, and that we could customize the grandfather provisions for missing middle housing built prior to 1945. So these are really the buildings that were built in a way that fit well into our neighborhood. These really were the historic ones that we think about that are pleasant and that fit well into the neighborhood, that we would propose allowing them to be renovated and used, and to continue to be used, as long as the square footage of the building does not increase. We wouldn't want to create a way to make something bigger in the neighborhood that wasn't intended to be there. But we do want to make a way for these things that are already there in the neighborhood. They've been there since 1945. We want to make a way for it to be easy to maintain them and invest in them over time. Okay, the next thing is historic lot patterns. And so this again is this idea of protecting our neighborhood character. So in 1982, when our current zoning code, which is the zoning code we're working off of today, was adopted in 1982, it established regulations and dimensions and requirements for the whole city, but also for our neighborhoods. And what it did is, in many of our neighborhoods, it created dimensions and regulations that didn't match the neighborhood. So in our R districts, our single-family districts, R1 through R5. There's many parts of our city where the R zoning category says, for example, in R4, you have to have a 7-foot side yard. That's the requirement in R4 zoning. Well, that R4 zoning got applied to neighborhoods in our city that never had 7-foot side yards in the neighborhood. That was never, the neighborhood had been there for 100 years, and that was never the yard that was in the neighborhood. And so what we want to do is enable neighborhoods who have a historic pattern that's different than the R zoning that got put on top of them in 1982. We want them to have a way to accommodate for those differences in a way that's easier than today, which is today you would have to get a variance to do anything to recognize that different dimension. So what we're proposing is in R1 through R5, allowing you for the calculation of your lot area, so the amount of area you have on your lot, but also for the requirement in the zoning code for the frontage, the width of the lot, we want to allow you to use the predominant pattern that exists on the block face to establish what that number should be. So what that means is, just here is a good example. If you have a historic block pattern, you would look at the block that you're on and you would determine what's the predominant character, the predominant number, the predominant pattern on this block face, and you would be able to use that number that's already established as a historic precedent for that being the regulation and the dimension that you would be allowed to replicate. Okay, also in the category of protecting neighborhood character, there's several neighborhoods that, again, over the last 10 or 20 years, as we planned for the future of our neighborhoods all over the city, many neighborhoods have noted that there's some basic limited design elements that they would like to see new single-family homes that are built in the neighborhood would adhere to. Today, in our zoning regulations for your single-family neighborhoods, there's really no design regulations at all. Our single-family zoning regulations today tell you how big your yard has to be, they tell you how tall the home can be, tell you that you're allowed to have a resident there, they'll tell you what the parking needs to be, but the single-family zoning says nothing at all about the aesthetic or the form or the design of the new home that gets built. And again, many neighborhoods have begun to note over the last 10 or 20 years that they just wish there was a little bit more that our regulations would require. We've got many other zoning districts in our city that are starting to require an urban design, a little bit of some design control, but our neighborhoods have not done that. Today, if you want some design in your neighborhood for new construction, you would have to get a historic district designation for your neighborhood. Some neighborhoods have done that. Many neighborhoods have not. And that can be a difficult thing to achieve, especially if all you wanted was a limited set of design. So what we're proposing here is that in our R4 and R5 zoning districts, and again, our single-family neighborhoods, we have R1 through R5. So we're proposing in our R4 and our R5 neighborhoods, which are more of our traditional, a little bit more in historic areas of our city, that the R4 and R5 zoning districts have a limited set of design controls in that district. So here's some of the things we're thinking. One would be that if you had a garage on the house, and if it was a forward-facing or a street-facing garage, that garage would be located at least 20 feet behind the front of the house. We don't want to see new homes getting built in our historic neighborhoods where the garage is right up at the front, and then the door of the house is either even with the garage or it's set back behind the garage. That's not really fitting with the character of these R4 and R5 neighborhoods, and it's something that we think this would start to address. We would also require that for blocks that have a porch or stoop character, so 50% or more of the homes on a block had a predominant porch or stoop character, that new homes would replicate that. And it's important to note here, this would all apply to new construction. So this doesn't apply to all the existing homes that are in the zoning districts and in the neighborhood. This would be just for new construction. Also requiring a street-facing front door and window on the front of the house, just to, again, make sure that that's something that's provided on any new home in an R4 and R5 neighborhood. And then this is the other part that's a little bit more technical, so I hope you can follow and I explain this well. So what we're proposing here is that for the neighborhoods that have, or for the lots that have smaller side yards than what the zoning requires. So think back to my example of if you're R4 zoning, you're required to have 7-foot yards on both sides of the house. If you have a home that's existing and it never met that, what we're proposing is that you could keep that side yard as it is today. You could even add on and renovate and expand the house and go up or go back with the house if you wanted to and retain that side yard. You wouldn't have to get a variance for that side yard. But what we're proposing is that the total height of the house would be reduced by the total amount that your side yards are not conforming to the required zoning. So let's follow this example on the bottom. So if the side yard setback is 7 feet and an existing house had a 4-foot yard on one side and a 5-foot yard on the other, they would be a total of 5 feet not in compliance with the 7-foot on both sides. And so what that would mean is in the zoning district, the house would only be able to be 5 feet lower than what is allowed today, which is 35 feet, which would then mean that you could build up to a 30-foot height limit. And what this is basically trying to do is say that if you have a home that's really close to another lot, closer than what the zoning calls for, that's okay, but it's not okay if you start to get really tall. A really tall home next to somebody else's lot is something that you ought to now really conform with the 7-foot side yard. And so this is just enabling an existing home to accommodate an expansion, but if it's going to be too tall, it would have to stick with the 7-foot side yard. That's very technical, and we can talk more about that when we break up and we can walk through that some more. But these are the ideas we have to enable existing homes in R4 and R5 to accommodate the historic character of the neighborhood. Okay, also in the theme of protecting neighborhood character, here we want to address what is, many of you may not even realize that this is an issue with the zoning, but there's some issues with what we call the transitional height plane in our zoning districts today in the city of Atlanta. A transitional height plane is what this image shows here on the bottom of the slide. A transitional height plane is used all over the city whenever there's development that's being built close to single-family neighborhoods. When you have commercial development, we have multifamily development, mixed-use development, higher density development that's built close to neighborhoods. Today, there's a requirement for transitional height planes, but there's a couple issues or problems that need to get resolved to make that a stronger regulation. Number one is today, the way the zoning is written, it says that if you have a single-family property that's contiguous and directly adjacent to a commercial property or a multifamily property, that there has to be this transitional height plane. Well, that can be a problem if the property if there's a mixed use or commercial or multifamily property close to a neighborhood, but it doesn't directly abut the neighborhood. You could have a gap of 20 feet between a development that's going to build high density and the neighborhood. There could be one lot between a big development and the neighborhood that would make the big development not have to require and provide the transitional height plane. So we want to change the transitional height plane requirement so it's not based on an adjacency to the neighborhood, but it's based on a distance to the neighborhood. So that neighborhoods can have a little bit more protection and know that development that's within a certain distance of the neighborhood is going to have to comply with the transitional height plane, whether that property abuts the neighborhood or not. And the last thing we're proposing to do is that there are some older zoning districts that were written in 1982, that were written at a time when it didn't yet understand some of the newer zoning districts that have been written in the last 10 years. And those older 1982 zoning districts need to catch up with some of the newer zoning districts. So what we're proposing here is a change to all the zoning districts so that there would be a transitional height plane whenever you're in the following condition. Whenever you're near anything that's R1 through R5, Anything that's near R1 through R5 would have a transitional height plane. If you were in RG1 or RG2, which is multifamily, MR1 or MR2, which is multifamily, or the missing middle district we've talked about, or any landmark district or historic district or a planned development district or an SBI district that has those similar types of areas like R1 through R5, that any of those districts would kick in a transitional height plane if there was development next to those types of districts. Okay, that's all very technical. We have some more. That's about half of the presentation, and Caleb Rossico is going to walk us through the rest, and then we'll have the rest of the night to be able to engage with you and talk through any questions you have.
The other, another goal of these zoning ordinance updates is to do what we're calling create vibrant corridors and districts. These are really the portions of our city that are not the treasured single-family areas, that are not the treasured neighborhoods. The first set of changes in this part of the code relates to how Atlanta regulates industrial districts, places like I-1 or I-2. We've seen in recent decades that industrial districts have experienced quite a bit of growth pressure, and many of them have begun to change. And the city doesn't necessarily have the tools to address some of these concerns. The first of the concerns that we heard in the diagnostic process was about the fact that industrial districts in Atlanta today allow a heck of a lot of uses that are not industrial in nature. So you may not be aware of this, but the I-1 zoning district, light industrial, allows for big box retail. It allows for hotels. It allows for restaurants. It allows for all of these other things that can actually destabilize the industrial area. So this first set of changes is based on a premise that the city must have viable industrial districts that are purely industrial use. And so the proposed change would do one very important thing. It would essentially take all of those non-industrial uses, restaurants and bars, retail, hotels, etc., and make them illegal in all cases except one. And that one case relates to what if you have a historic mill building or a historic other building in an industrial district that is really of such an architectural merit or configuration or size and shape that it really isn't viable for current industrial uses. And so the particular change here expands a current provision in the zoning ordinance that allows multifamily residential to actually go in within those buildings if they're 50 years or older. And so what we would do here is we would create a provision that says, although all of those uses I mentioned are prohibited, if you have an older building, think of Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill or Studioplex on Auburn or some of the older buildings in Howell Mill Road, and they are zoned industrial, you can reuse those buildings, you can make an adaptive reuse of those buildings and put the modern uses in them as a way to reflect sort of the historic preservation perspective. So that particular provision makes the industrial uses more purely industrial. Now, with that said, we all know that many neighborhoods actually do want to mix. They would like to have areas that had a much finer grain of residential, of commercial, of office, of industrial than this particular I-1 change provides. So because of that, the city has been talking about creating an industrial mixed-use district for several years. And this process actually proposes that new district as an available zoning tool for neighborhoods. The iMix district, as we're calling it, would be a completely new zoning district that would allow neighborhoods that want to have that finer grain mix to do so while at the same time ensuring that we keep some viable industries in that area. So what it does is it creates a provision in this new iMix district that 30% of every development must contain industrial uses. And it defines those. They're obviously very light industrial uses that don't have a lot of noise or vibration or sound. Things like small furniture makers, small breweries, not incinerators or glue factories or any of the more intense uses. So it mandates that every development has those uses. It also incorporates what we're calling concurrency requirements, which essentially is a way to tell a developer that they must have the industrial use open and with a valid certificate of occupancy before the city will release a certificate of occupancy for the non-industrial area. And the reason we did that is because if you think of parts of the city where you may have a master plan development that wants to have this, we wanted to make a way that the code did not allow a developer to come in and say they were going to build a brewery or a light industrial use, but that was going to be phase 5. They were going to build the condos in phase 1, the shopping in phase 2, the hotel in phase 3, and maybe one day do the industrial use in the future. This provision requires it all to be sequential as the development is built out. Now, in terms of what the new district is, it is a relatively medium density zoning district with a floor area ratio of around 3.3. So similar to your C2 districts, your MRC2 districts, and with comparable height planes. But in addition, because this area would be more mixed use and design is really, really important, there would also be all of the traditional design provisions in some of the newer quality of life zoning districts incorporated into it. Which brings up one of the specific quality of life zoning districts. We talked about industrial districts, but the city also has mixed use zoning districts already on the books that are called MRC, or Mixed Residential Commercial. These were created about 20 years ago. Since the districts were created, a lot of portions of the city have in fact been rezoned to them. But we've noticed, as part of the diagnostic process, that the MRC1, which is sort of the lower intensity, and the MRC3, which is sort of the higher intensity, are very frequently used. There's a lot of MRC1 in neighborhood commercial areas, and there's a lot of MRC3. This middle density, mixed residential 2, is very infrequently used. And the reason for that is that if you look at the blue in the bottom of the chart, the blue indicates how much residential you can build. You'll notice that the amount of residential permitted in MRC1 at left and MRC2 in the middle are identical. And so, that density is relatively low. It's a garden apartment density. It doesn't allow more of a traditional urban apartment building or even an urban townhome. So in order to get around that, developers are asking the city to approve rezoning to a much, much higher MRC3 designation because all they really want is a little bit more of the blue. They don't care about the orange, which is the commercial provision. So what we're seeing many areas and neighborhoods granted much more zoning density as an aggregate, residential plus commercial, than is really needed. And so to address that, we have proposed keeping the density, meaning the height of the bars or the total amount of development allowed, the same in all of those districts, but within that critical MRC2 district, allowing the developer to use some of that orange, use some of that non-residential for residential purposes. Again, the idea there is it's not good public policy to rezone areas for much higher density if only a lower density would suffice. And so the idea is to make that tool more conforming with sort of what the neighborhood vision is. Okay, so that was corridors. The next set of revisions relates to what we're calling improving transportation or expanding transportation options. And really this means parking and loading. The first provision is regarding the current City of Atlanta's loading requirements, which, as you probably know, say that for every new development, you have to provide a certain number of loading spaces of 12 by 35 and 12 by 55. The current loading requirements date from 1982, when there were a lot fewer but larger trucks that came to many of the businesses. And so, as a result, the city made property owners incorporate a lot of loading spaces for very large trucks. What we've seen in recent years, recent decades really, is that the changing methodology and sort of the computer information is allowing for smaller trucks, but it's also allowing for greater efficiency in loading. And so because of that, the City of Atlanta Board of Zoning Appeals hears a remarkably high number of variances to actually remove the city loading requirements. And they're all granted. They're virtually all granted, just because even the BZA recognizes that a grocery store doesn't need 5 loading docks or 4. So in order to recognize that, this proposed change would make a couple of citywide changes to loading. The first thing it would do is to reduce the number to a number that was still comparable with peer communities in the region and peer larger American cities. But it would also make 2 additional changes. One, it would allow developments that may have residential and commercial or retail and offices to actually share their loading spaces, which intuitively makes a lot of sense, but isn't actually permitted in the code today. The other thing it would do is it would say, if you had buildings that were built before the city had a loading requirement, i.e. before 1965, there is no loading space requirement. So an older building that may be built to the entire lot line and has no available land could proceed without having to get a variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals. Now, most developers, most tenants will want to make sure adequate provisions are there, but this would be available as well. In addition, one of the things that would be done is that there would be an allowance in certain cases for the Director of Public Works, the Commissioner of Public Works, to allow any existing on-street loading zones to also count towards the loading requirements. And I'd like to, again, provide a big caveat to this. They must be officially sanctioned zones, and there would be a provision where if there's a traffic concern or a safety concern, they are not a by right matter. So, in addition to loading, the other major transportation change regards around parking. Today, the City of Atlanta has a parking ordinance that is largely based on the 1982 Zoning Ordinance. That said, the requirements are extremely high, both compared to peer American cities and even many of the Atlanta suburbs. I work in Milton, Roswell, Alpharetta, Snellville, Johns Creek, and they all actually have loading requirements, or most of them have parking requirements that are less than the City of Atlanta. So this is really important to the city for a couple of reasons. Parking and the supply of parking have impacts related to transportation, environment, public health, historic preservation, environmental air quality, even affordability and equity. And we have a board in the other room that talks a little bit about that. Additionally, Atlanta as a region has, I believe, spent $4 billion on MARTA, maybe a bit more. And the reliance and the requirement of parking around MARTA stations creates a true disincentive to the type of development that could take advantage of the MARTA stations. So, with that in mind, a series of proposed changes that would begin to change how Atlanta thinks about parking are proposed as part of this zoning ordinance update. The first one is relatively easy. It would allow property owners in the city to count on-street parking, again, official on-street parking that is sanctioned by the city towards their on-street parking requirements. So if I'm a small commercial building in Virginia Highland or Westview or West End or East Atlanta Village, and I have 3 parking spaces in front of my building, I would be able to count those. Additionally, the proposal before you this evening for consideration would actually eliminate most off-street parking requirements for any building built at a time when the city had no parking requirement, effectively 1965. The idea here is that the buildings were legal when they were constructed. They tend to be buildings that are very important to the character of neighborhoods. We have seen cases of where developers have torn down historic buildings to provide parking instead of having to get a variance through the Board of Zoning Appeals. And so this particular change would allow most of those buildings to be used by right. Now there is one caveat that I wanted to put out, and you'll see it sort of at the bottom of the bullet. We know that in the city of Atlanta, bars, restaurants, nightclubs, other places of live music, can have a very real impact on neighborhood quality of life. And so this particular provision would actually require any of those uses that were over 2,000 square feet to continue to have to meet the parking requirement. And again, the reason for that is because all of those other uses that would be exempted are true neighborhood amenities. They're things like bakeries and hardware stores and retail shops. And they're things that the community, generally speaking, doesn't have a lot of concern about, and they also don't generate a lot of the out of neighborhood demand. But those other uses that hold a valid liquor license do tend to have a much broader impact, and so that's why we've proposed to exempt them. Additionally, a couple of other minor changes that would be citywide applications. The first regards elderly housing, which is a term the City of Atlanta defines. This proposed text amendment would lower the parking requirement on elderly housing from the city's standard to about half a space per unit, which is in line with the variances that the Board of Zoning Appeals has approved. It would also allow shared parking between all uses in the zoning districts that do not allow it today, effectively O&I, C, I, and RG. And then finally, around transit stations, it would actually remove all parking requirements. All parking requirements within a quarter mile of what we're calling a fixed guideway transit station or stop, which effectively means a MARTA station, an Atlanta streetcar station, or a future Atlanta Beltline station if it is actually open and under construction. Now,
include BRTs?
if BRT conforms to the fixed guideway aspect that FTA has, it would be available. Effectively, what Maria is asking is if a bus facility came in and it had a dedicated right-of-way, yes, it could conform. If the bus ran in street with the traffic, it could not conform as proposed. And then finally, within this area, there's also a parking cap that would be created so that around MARTA stations, developers don't provide hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of parking spaces in areas where you really want the city to have lower parking usage. And then finally, with all these things, this is really a housekeeping change. We would need to update the Beltline Ordinance to remove some current conflicts that it has with these various provisions. Next change, and I promise you I'm almost done, is in the area of creating more user-friendly regulations. Now, if you've read the Atlanta Zoning Ordinance, you know it's not the most user-friendly document, and we hope some of these changes will help address some of the more egregious concerns. The first of those changes is in the area of telecommunications. There have been some relatively recent changes to state law that the city needs to align its code with. The code is in conformance with the state requirement, but the procedural provisions, the layout of the ordinance, the structure of it, could be better aligned to make that absolutely clear. And so this particular change does that. It does not increase where towers can go. It does not increase the ability to build cell towers in neighborhoods. It purely is to align with recent state provisions. One of the other set of changes relates to definitions. The city of Atlanta has some definitions that are pretty wonky in our opinion and in the opinion of the public that we talked to. The first one of those is in downtown Atlanta, where the city classifies a bicycle repair shop and a bicycle shop and a car dealer as the same use. And so downtown Atlanta, about 8 years ago, updated their zoning, and they didn't want to allow car shops, but they also made it illegal to sell bicycles in downtown. So what we're doing as part of SPI 1 in downtown is to change the code so those become two separate uses. In addition, we will be updating, but really clarifying how the city calculates floor area for mixed-use developments. If you think of what we call live-work units, where a homeowner may be in a commercial zone and wants to have a shop out of the ground floor and live above, the city doesn't have a clear method for determining how does that commercial area count and how does that residential area count towards floor area. So this would clarify it. Additionally, we're updating the city's definition of place of worship, not to mention specific denominations. No change in terms of the regulations, just making it more reflective of who we are as a city today and the diversity of faiths within it. Creating a definition of fixed guideway transit to, as Maria mentioned or sort of alluded to before, define exactly what that means. And then finally, one area that we're not changing is the way that the city calculates building height and cellars and attics. We had heard a lot during the diagnostic process that is very confusing, and folks are absolutely correct. But we really can't change those provisions to conform with the building code and other neighborhood policies. At this time, we feel that change, if it occurs, must be part of the bigger zoning ordinance rewrite, or it could have some pretty significant negative repercussions. And additionally, we are clarifying the language related to how the City of Atlanta grants administrative variances and what are called the quality of life districts. These are things like neighborhood commercial, MR, mixed residential, commercial, and live work. The code today empowers city staff to grant certain variances and for others to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, but it doesn't really specify them as clearly as they could be. So what this change would do is very clearly state that setbacks, transitional yards, height planes, open space, building height, fence height, parking, loading, and signs all must go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, which, as you know, means they must go to MPUs and they must go through a public hearing. All of those other things, really more design provisions about, if you have a tree in the middle of the sidewalk, you need a variance to save the tree rather than constructing a 20-foot wide sidewalk. Those could be handled administratively. And in a nutshell, those are the proposed changes before you. I recognize that we have talked quite a bit, and we also recognize that you may have many, many questions, and so we're going to be here as long as we need to answer those. But before we do that, we really, really, really want to hear from you. As Mary mentioned in the beginning, every single idea we've talked about this evening is a draft for feedback. Absolutely nothing is set in stone, and we really, really want to hear from you, which is why we're conducting these sessions and the series of sessions in the coming weeks. So as part of that, we ask you to do the following this evening. Please go to the other room, review the boards, and ask us questions. We'll all be in there. Then we ask you to share your thoughts in a couple of ways. We're going to have comment sheets that are in the middle of the table that essentially ask you to check the meeting date you're at in the top right, to check the topic that you're interested in, and then tell us your neighborhood and fill out what your particular concern is below. And we ask you to write both concerns, and if you like an idea, let us know you like it. In addition, we have a second part of that exercise, or should I say an alternative to that exercise, one that's a bit more enjoyable, and which I see many of you have already started doing. If you want to let your comments be known to more people than just the city or the consultant team, and you don't really want to put them on a comment card, take a sticky note, write your comment, and put it right on the board, so that if you're strongly agree with or strongly feel strongly about your opinion, everyone can know. And then finally, we would like to tell you that we know a lot of these ideas require a lot of thought and consideration. So the presentation this evening is available at zoningatl.com. And when you go to that link, there's an opportunity for you to contact us. So you can also submit any comments that you may have that way. If you do want to hear this a briefer version of this presentation or review the boards in the future, also please make sure you've signed up and you'll get email notification about some of the upcoming meetings in a few weeks. So with that said, I really, really want to thank you for coming out tonight. We're going to be here as long as we need to hear from you, and have the food and have the sandwiches. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Do you have a deadline for when you're trying to get feedback in by?
The feedback?
Feedback. Mid-May, is that correct? Middle of May.
Okay, thanks.
Maria?
One thing that I've noticed is this kind of explosion of storage units. Is there any kind of, I keep hearing that the city may want to have a moratorium, like especially around the Belt Line, to allow that. And with this specific concern, 10th and Monroe, the developer has said that they could build a storage unit there, so would you rather have a big development, a hotel, you know?
That is currently not part of the quick fixes. I know there was some talk about it. I'm not sure where it stands at City Hall, Mary. Do you have?
I'm not sure at this point.
But if that is a concern, or if something that we've talked about is of concern to you, we also have a other box for you to check and write your concerns there as well. Yes, sir?
First of all, can anybody answer how many of y'all are original born Atlantans, native Atlantans? Okay, we're only about 10% roughly in the room. What happened in 1982 that changed? Because I heard several things even.
So the zoning ordinance was rewritten. The city, yep, and this man here was part of it. Very progressive. And it was a full city-wide rewrite. They tend to happen about every 40 years, so we're getting there. And at that time, as you know, the city was going through a huge growth spurt. The city of Atlanta threw out some of the more, I would say, urban-friendly codes, the ones that actually reflected the patterns of the city, and adopted what I would call more suburban-oriented codes. And so that was part of a whole series of other changes that occurred. It wasn't just that, but effectively that's what it was. The city had one way of developing, changed the regs in 82, worked for about 20 years, and then the city began changing the 82 regs piecemeal. This is another set of changes to those, but the city will very likely be moving forward shortly with an RFP to hire a consultant to have a complete code rewrite. So these are the short sort of quick
It's
fixes.
organic, to be fair. I mean, only like Washington is a planned city, is my.
No, it absolutely is, but
It's organic, so.
the city is very organic, but when the code is organic, it creates problems because you have a lot of conflicts. So this effort is about eliminating some major conflicts, and then the full zoning ordinance update should be about that bigger goal. And that bigger update will be guided by various city policies, neighborhood plans, CDP, et cetera.
Thank you.
Yes, sir?
I came in late to the question, and that is, and I've been around for a long time, I don't think I went board here. Back in the 30 years ago, when a major development was proposed, the zoning folks required a traffic study to go with it. That no longer happens. And I would hope that that's something that is being considered and needs to be initiated, doesn't need to be in the ordinance, probably.
Excellent comment. Write it, check that other box and put it on the sheet. It's not part of this initiative, this particular set of changes. There is a development of regional impact provision, but that only applies to very large projects. So if you would like the city, yeah, I mean, put it down, and that's an important point. Any of those comments that don't necessarily relate to this set of revisions will be shared with the code writer that the city eventually hires. So, Sally, and then I want to break because I really want to hear from everyone. Yes?
Is there a glossary that's easy to find so that people know what an R1, R5, elderly housing, what that means?
We don't have one, but we can look at creating it.
I think it'd be really helpful.
That is another very important point. For the first round of zoning ordinance rewrite changes, we did prepare an FAQ, and we did have several questions related to, what are historic districts, what aren't historic districts. So we'll make sure that we put that in the appendix.
We actually do have one.
Oh, you do have
And
one?
if you, I'm sorry, we do actually have a glossary of all of our acronyms, and if you give me your email address, we can get that to you.
Okay,
Great. Well, again, thank you. Move to the room next door. We'll be here for questions, and we look forward to hearing from you.